Excellence cannot be rushed. Innovation
Hamburg,
requires
November
integrity.
1943. Under cold fluorescent lights, a German engineer's chisel snaps against wood. Not breaks, snaps. Like striking concrete. Around him, the Luftwaffe's best minds stare at the wreckage of a British bomber that shouldn't exist. No rivets, no armor. Just plywood and glue. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel presses his thumb against the seam until it bleeds. The adhesive won't yield. In that moment, as his blood smears across enemy wood, Germany's master of materials realizes the unthinkable they are losing to carpenters. The smell hit them first. Not cordite, not aviation fuel, not the familiar metallic tang of duralumin that filled every Luftwaffe maintenance facility from the Channel to the Urals. This was different, organic, almost domestic. It smelled like a furniture workshop sawdust wood varnish and something chemical underneath.
Innovation
Something that made your eyes
integrity.
water if you got too close. Fliegerhorst, Kommandantur, Hamburg, Fuhlsbüttel. November 18, 1943. No 3:40 hours. Outside Hangar 7, snow fell through the skeletal remains of anti-aircraft positions, dusting the tarmac, where Me-109s normally roosted. Inside, under a constellation of work lights strung from the steel rafters, lay something that would shake the foundations of German military confidence more thoroughly than any strategic setback on the Eastern Front. De Havilland Mosquito serial number DZ414. Shot down 3 days prior over the Ruhr by flak. Not fighters. Never fighters. The aircraft had belly landed in a beet field outside Essen. The pilot and navigator were already dead when the recovery team arrived, but the aircraft itself was almost pristine. Towed under cover of darkness to Hamburg, it now rested like a dissected insect wings. Detached engine cowlings removed every panel, numbered and catalogued. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel arrived at dawn, his breath misting in the unheated hangar. At 41, he was one of the Luftwaffe's senior materials scientists, a man who had spent the previous decade studying aluminum alloys, magnesium composites, and the metallurgical properties of aircraft steel. He had written 17 papers on structural integrity. He had consulted on the Messerschmitt 262 jet program. His recommendations had reinforced the wings of the FW-190. He had never in his entire career been asked to examine a wooden airplane. Herr Doctor. Oberst Werner Vogel, the facility commander, approached with a clipboard thick with preliminary reports. Your assessment. Henkel didn't answer immediately. He was circling the fuselage like a skeptical art critic, running his gloved fingers along the surface. The skin was smooth, unnaturally smooth for wood, and when he rapped his knuckles against it, the sound was dull dense. Not the hollow knock of plywood furniture, but something more substantial, more integrated. When was the last combat engagement? Henkel asked. 48 hours before it was hit. Bombed the Krupp's facility at 28,000 feet. Top speed. Vogel consulted his notes. Estimated at 640 kilometers per hour. Henkel stopped walking. That's impossible. We clocked it ourselves. 3 separate radar stations. Oberst, our best fighter, the Gustav achieved 670 at maximum combat power. And that's with a Daimler-Benz 12-cylinder 475 horsepower. He gestured at the exposed Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. These are comparable output. But this aircraft has no turrets, no armor plate, no... He paused, touching the fuselage again. It has no weight. The first technical team had been working through the night. 7 engineers, all specialists in aeronautical design, now stood in a loose semicircle around the port wing. Their faces showed the particular exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from confronting something that violated everything they understood about their field. Hauptmann Dieter Cross, a structures engineer who had worked on the Heinkel 177, spoke first. His voice carried the hoarseness of too much cigarette smoke and not enough rest. Herr Doctor, we've removed 12 inspection panels. Standard procedure for captured aircraft. Except... He gestured helplessly. There are no bolts, no rivets, no mechanical fasteners of any kind in the primary structure. Henkel moved closer. In the harsh light, he could see where the team had carefully separated a section of the wing skin from its underlying framework. The separation line was clean, almost surgical, revealing layers of wood veneer, arranged in alternating grain patterns. But what held his attention was the bonding surface, a dark, glassy layer, no thicker than paper. "The adhesive?" he asked. "We don't know," Cross admitted. "Nothing we've tested. It doesn't respond to heat up to 180 degrees Celsius. Doesn't dissolve in acetone benzene or carbon tetrachloride. Schroeder?" He nodded toward a younger engineer. "Tried to mechanically separate a joint with a cold chisel." Henkel looked at Schroeder, who held up his right hand. The index finger was bandaged. "The chisel shattered," Schroeder said quietly. "The wood split. The glue didn't." For several seconds, the only sound in the hangar was the whisper of snow against the high windows and the distant rumble of a truck convoy on the access road. Then Henkel walked to his equipment case and removed a German-made carpenter's chisel, Solingen steel, the best in the world, and approached the fuselage. He selected a seam where two panels met at the wing root, positioned the chisel at a 15-degree angle exactly as he'd been taught in his apprenticeship 40 years ago under his carpenter father, applied steady pressure. Steady. The chisel skipped off the surface. He tried again, harder this time, using both hands. The chisel bit into the wood maybe 2 millimeters, then stopped. He increased pressure until his knuckles went white. The chisel bent. Actually bent the Solingen steel, flexing like rubber before his eyes. "Gott im Himmel," someone whispered behind him. Henkel set down the ruined tool and removed his gloves. With his bare fingers, he traced the joint line. The glue layer was so thin, it was almost invisible, yet where the chisel had scored it, the material showed no deformation, no cracking, no delamination. It was as if the wood and adhesive had been grown together rather than joined. "Bring me a microscope," he said, "and get Professor Ziegler from the Technical University. Tell him it's urgent." While they waited, Henkel conducted his own examination. The wood itself was unlike any aircraft material he'd encountered. The outer skin appeared to be birch 3-ply, maybe 4, each layer thinner than his fingernail. But sandwiched in the middle was something else. Something so light, it seemed almost foam-like, yet when he pressed against an exposed section, it compressed only slightly before becoming rigid. "Balsa?" said a voice behind him. Henkel turned. Dr. Ernst Ziegler, professor of organic chemistry, stood in the hangar entrance, snowflakes melting on his wool coat. He was 72, officially retired, but still maintained laboratory privileges at the university. Henkel had studied under him 20 years earlier. "Balsa wood, if I'm not mistaken?" Ziegler continued, approaching the wing. "Ochroma pyramidale, native to Central and South America. Extraordinary strength-to-weight ratio, the best of any natural material. The Incas used it for their rafts." He smiled slightly, though I doubt they had this in mind. "Can we source it?" Oberst Vogel asked immediately. Ziegler's smile faded. "Hauptsächlich from Ecuador," which he didn't need to finish. Ecuador, technically neutral, but effectively under Allied control, its exports flowing to Britain and America, not Germany. "Then we substitute," Vogel said. "Pine beech, whatever grows in Bavaria." "It's not that simple." Henkel was still examining the wing structure. "Professor, look at this layering. The density gradation. Balsa in the core for lightness, birch on the faces for strength. The grain patterns alternate every layer. It's like plywood," Ziegler finished. "But engineered at a level of precision I've never seen. This isn't carpentry, Henkel. This is material science disguised as woodworking." Over the next 6 hours, they dissected the Mosquito with the care of surgeons and the obsessiveness of desperate men. What they found defied not just their expectations, but their entire conceptual framework of what an aircraft could be. The fuselage was a monocoque structure, No internal framework, the skin itself carrying all structural loads. But unlike metal monocoques, which relied on riveted aluminum sheets over formers and stringers, this was a single unified shell. Two half-shells actually molded over concrete forms, and then joined along a center line. The joint itself was so perfect that Cross couldn't find it without reference marks. "They're building aircraft," Cross said slowly, "the way we build violins." It was an apt comparison. The Mosquito's construction had more in common with a Stradivarius than a Messerschmitt. Every curve calculated, every thickness optimized, the entire structure designed to resonate with stress rather than resist it. Where German engineers used brute strength, thick materials, heavy reinforcement, the British had used elegance. The Mosquito didn't overpower physics, it danced with it. By late afternoon, Professor Ziegler had set up a makeshift laboratory in the corner of the hangar. Under his microscope, samples of the mystery adhesive revealed their secrets. The resin was phenol formaldehyde synthetic, not natural modified, with what appeared to be wood flower fillers and possibly cashew nutshell liquid. Revolutionary in 1943, though the basics had been known since Bakelite's invention decades earlier. "It's the application that's brilliant," Ziegler explained to the assembled engineers. "They're not just gluing pieces together. They're creating a composite. The adhesive penetrates the wood fiber's bonds at a molecular level. When it cures under heat and pressure, you don't have wood and glue, you have a new material entirely, stronger than either component alone." "Can we replicate it?" Vogel demanded. Ziegler removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly. "Technically, perhaps. Practically," he gestured at the Mosquito. "This aircraft represents thousands of hours of empirical development, trial and error. They've solved problems we don't even know exist yet. The mixing ratios, the curing temperatures, the pressure application, the quality control." He shook his head. "We could copy the chemistry, but chemistry isn't enough." Henkel understood what Ziegler wasn't saying. The Mosquito wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was a triumph of manufacturing culture. Britain had thousands of skilled woodworkers, furniture makers, piano builders, boatwrights, all suddenly relevant to the war effort. Germany had systematically moved toward all-metal construction, treating wood as obsolete primitive. They had the metallurgists, but not the craftsmen. "There's something else," Schroeder said. He was standing by the nose section, holding a sheaf of photographs. "We found these in the navigator's map case. Reconnaissance photos. Look at the detail, you can read license plates on the vehicles." Henkel examined the images. They showed the Krupp's facility 2 days before the Mosquito was shot down. Every building, every ack-ack position, every blast wall documented in crystalline clarity. Shot from 28,000 feet at 400 miles per hour by an unarmed wooden aircraft crewed by 2 men. "They're using them as reconnaissance platforms too," Vogel said. "Not just bombers." "Fast enough to outrun interception," Henkel added. "High enough to avoid most flak. No armor, no guns, because they're not planning to get caught." He set down the photographs. "Herr Oberst, this isn't just an aircraft. It's a philosophy. Speed as protection, weight as the enemy. Everything else is secondary." As evening fell and the work lights grew harsh against the gathering darkness, Henkel found himself alone with the Mosquito. The other engineers had gone to brief Göring's staff via secure teletype. Ziegler had returned to his laboratory with samples. Only Henkel remained walking slowly around the disassembled bomber, trying to understand not just what it was, but what it meant. He thought of his father dead, 20 years now, who had built cabinets and tables in a small shop in Göttingen. His father who had taught him that wood was a living material, that every piece had its own character, its own grain and strength. His father who had been disappointed when young Karl chose science over craftsmanship. The Mosquito was both. It was his father's understanding of wood married to Henkel's understanding of stress and load. It was art and mathematics tradition and innovation all bonded together with modern chemistry. He pressed his hand against the fuselage one more time. Still that dense solid feel. Still that faint smell of resin and sawdust. Outside, he could hear the air raid sirens beginning their nightly wail. Soon Lancasters and Halifaxes would be overhead dropping their bombs on Hamburg's ruins. And among them, invisible in the darkness, wooden mosquitoes would be marking targets, photographing damage, doing the precision work, while the heavyweights did the smashing. Germany had built its air force on the philosophy of overwhelming power. Fighters with cannons, bombers with heavy defensive armament, everything designed to dominate through superior force. The Mosquito represented the opposite approach: achieve superiority through speed, maintain advantage through innovation, win not by being stronger, but by being smarter. Henkel walked to the hangar door and looked out at the snow-covered airfield. In the distance, Me-109s were being fueled for the night scramble. All metal fighters, products of Germany's industrial might. Beautiful machines. Deadly machines. But as the first bombs began to fall on the city's outskirts and the searchlights clawed at the sky, Henkel wondered if perhaps they had been building the wrong airplanes all along. Not wrong, technically, the 109 was a masterpiece of aviation design, but wrong philosophically. They had been so focused on making their aircraft stronger that they had forgotten to make them smarter. The Mosquito wasn't just a bomber, it was a repudiation of everything the Luftwaffe stood for. And tomorrow, when he submitted his report, Henkel would have to explain to men who believed in steel and armor and firepower that they had been defeated by wood and glue and imagination. The morning after his report landed on Göring's desk, Henkel received a summons. Not a request. A summons. The car arrived at 0600 hours, black Mercedes staff car with Reich Aviation Ministry plates, the driver saying nothing as they drove through Hamburg's bombed-out streets toward the rail station. Berlin by midday. The ministry building on Leipziger Strasse still stood, though scaffolding covered the eastern wing where incendiaries had gutted 3 floors the previous month. Henkel was directed not to Göring's office, but to a basement conference room, windowless, the air thick with cigarette smoke and something else. Desperation, maybe. The smell of men who knew they were losing. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring didn't arrive until nearly 1400 hours. When he did, the room snapped to attention. 12 officers, 5 engineers, 3 ministry officials, all watching as Germany's second most powerful man lowered himself into a chair that groaned under his weight. He wore his Luftwaffe uniform medals covering his chest like armor plate, but his face was pale sweat beading despite the room's chill. "Gentlemen," Göring said, his voice still carrying that theatrical boom that had once commanded crowds. "Dr. Henkel has informed us that we are being defeated by furniture makers." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Please, doctor, educate us." Henkel stood. His hands didn't shake a small victory. He'd prepared slides, technical drawings, chemical analyses. But looking at Göring's face, at the faces of the other men around that table, he understood that data wouldn't matter. These men didn't want to understand the Mosquito. They wanted to defeat it. The British de Havilland Mosquito represents a fundamental shift in aircraft design philosophy. Henkel began. It achieves performance equal to or exceeding our best fighters, despite being constructed entirely of wood. The key lies not in the material itself, but in the manufacturing process. "We know it's made of wood," Generaloberst Hans Jesenek interrupted. The Luftwaffe chief of staff looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Tell us how to shoot it down." "You can't." The words left Henkel's mouth before he could stop them. The room went silent. That is the aircraft's maximum speed at altitude exceeds 640 kilometers per hour. Our Me-109 Gustav in optimal conditions achieves 670. But the Mosquito operates at 28,000 feet, where our fighters struggle for power. By the time interception is achieved, the target has completed its mission and withdrawn. Göring leaned forward. "Then we build something faster. The Me-262 jet program is 6 months from operational deployment at minimum," Jesenek cut in. "We need solutions now, today. Can we copy it?" This was the question Henkel had been dreading. He clicked to the next slide, showing a cross-section of the Mosquito's wing structure. Technically, yes. We understand the principles. Birch plywood faces, balsa wood core, phenolic resin adhesive bonded under heat and pressure. The chemistry is relatively straightforward. Then do it, Göring said. Reichsmarshal, the difficulty isn't chemistry, it's culture. Henkel saw confusion ripple through the room. He pressed on. The Mosquito is produced by furniture manufacturers, piano makers, boat builders, craftsmen who've worked with wood their entire lives, who understand grain structure, moisture content, how different species behave under stress. We've spent the last decade converting our aviation industry to all-metal construction. We've trained our workforce to rivet and weld, not to laminate and glue. Are you telling me, Göring's voice dropped to something dangerous, that German engineering cannot match British carpentry? I'm saying we lack the manufacturing infrastructure. The Mosquito isn't hand-built. De Havilland produces them in quantity, but it requires tooling. We don't have materials we can't source and expertise that takes years to develop. Oberst Werner Baumbach, a bomber pilot who'd flown missions over England, spoke up. What about the adhesive? Your report mentioned it was stronger than the wood itself. Phenol formaldehyde resin. Modified, we believe, with wood flour and possibly cashew nutshell liquid as plasticizers. Under proper curing conditions, 160 degrees Celsius under 6 atmospheres of pressure, it creates a bond stronger than either substrate. Henkel paused. We tested it. A cold chisel couldn't separate a joint. The wood split first. Murmurs around the table. Göring raised a hand for silence. Dr. Henkel, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Can we build a German Mosquito, yes or no? Henkel thought of his father's workshop. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the rasp of a hand plane, the careful attention to grain and knot. He thought of the Mosquito in Hangar 7, that impossible marriage of art and science. He thought of the British factories where furniture makers were now building bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. No, he said quietly. Not in time to matter. The room erupted. 3 men shouting at once, Yeshonek on his feet, Göring slamming his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. But through the chaos, Henkel heard one voice calm and cold. Then we make them regret building it. The speaker was Oberst Dietrich Peltz, a fighter commander with a reputation for brutality. If we can't match their speed, we change the game. Force them to fly slower lower. Make them fight on our terms. How? Göring had regained his composure, but barely. Hit their production. The Mosquito is manufactured in specific facilities, Hatfield, Leavesden, a handful of others, concentrated targets. We send everything we have, burn the factories, kill the workers, destroy the tooling. You can't fly aircraft that don't exist. Henkel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Oberst, those are civilian facilities. Furniture factories converted to war production. The workers are craftsmen, not soldiers. Then they shouldn't be building bombers. Peltz didn't even look at him. Reichsmarshal, we've lost the technical race. I'm proposing we win the industrial one. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, spiraling into contingency plans and target lists and operational timelines. But Henkel stopped listening. He was thinking about the men who'd built that Mosquito. Piano makers whose fingers knew the resistance of spruce and maple. Cabinet builders who could see in 3 dimensions, who understood how wood moved and breathed. Boatwrights who'd spent decades creating curved forms from flat stock. They were defeating Germany not with superior numbers or better weapons, but with a different kind of knowledge. The kind his father had possessed. The kind that couldn't be taught in universities or captured in technical manuals. The wisdom of hands that had worked with living material for so long that the boundary between craftsman and craft had dissolved. When the meeting finally ended, Henkel found himself walking through Berlin's ruins toward his hotel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through skeletal buildings. A woman picked through rubble, searching for something, anything salvageable. 2 boys played in a bombed-out basement, their laughter surreal against the devastation. This was what the Mosquito meant. Not just technical defeat, but something deeper. Britain had taken its craftsmen, the men who built chairs and tables, who made pianos sing, who shaped wood into beauty, and turned them into weapons manufacturers without losing what made them craftsmen. Germany had tried to industrialize everything to reduce warfare to metallurgy and mass production, and in doing so, had lost something essential. At his hotel, a message waited. Professor Ziegler wanted to see him, urgently. They met in Ziegler's laboratory at the Technical University, a building that had somehow survived the bombing through sheer luck or divine intervention. The old professor was bent over his microscope, dozens of slides scattered across his workbench. Karl Ziegler said without preamble, "I've been analyzing the adhesive samples. There's something I didn't mention in my initial report." "What?" "The consistency. Every sample shows identical curing characteristics, identical molecular structure, identical bonding strength. Do you understand what that means?" Henkel shook his head. "It means quality control at a level I've never seen. Not just in the chemistry that's relatively straightforward, but in the application. Every joint perfectly mixed, perfectly applied, perfectly cured. Thousands of joints per aircraft. Hundreds of aircraft per month. Zero deviation." Ziegler looked up, his eyes red from hours at the microscope. "This isn't just good manufacturing. This is systematic excellence. They've standardized the process. More than that, they've created a culture where excellence is assumed, where every worker understands not just what to do, but why it matters, where pride and precision are inseparable." Ziegler removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes. "We can copy their chemistry, Karl. We can steal their designs, but we can't copy their culture. That takes generations." Henkel sat down heavily. Through the laboratory window, he could see the city spreading toward the horizon, a patchwork of ruins and desperate reconstruction. Somewhere out there, Peltz was probably already planning his raids on British furniture factories. Somewhere, British craftsmen were spreading glue on curved plywood forms, building the next generation of mosquitoes. "They're going to bomb the factories," Henkel said. Ziegler nodded slowly. "I heard. Will it work?" "In the short term, maybe. But Britain has dispersed production. The de Havilland plants are just the primary assembly points. Components are manufactured in workshops across the country. Small operations hard to target, easy to relocate." Henkel laughed bitterly. "You can't strategic bomb a craft industry. It's too distributed, too flexible. While we've concentrated everything, made ourselves vulnerable by seeking efficiency." "Exactly." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Ziegler spoke, his voice careful. "Karl, what did you tell them in the meeting?" "The truth. That we can't replicate the Mosquito in any meaningful time frame." "And?" "They didn't want to hear it. Göring wants a German version. Faster, stronger, more advanced. He's authorized a crash program, all the resources we need, unlimited priority." Henkel met his old professor's eyes. "He's calling it the Focke-Wulf Ta 154, all-wood construction night fighter configuration. First prototype in 6 months." "Impossible." "I know. You'll need balsa wood. We have none. The adhesive formulation will take months to perfect. The tooling doesn't exist. The workforce isn't trained." Ziegler counted off each problem on his fingers. "And even if you solve all that, you're still copying someone else's innovation. You'll always be one step behind." "I know," Henkel repeated. He walked to the window. Outside, evening was falling over Berlin. Soon the bombers would come again, and among them, invisible and untouchable wooden ghosts would photograph the damage mark, new targets prepare tomorrow's destruction. But what choice do I have? Tell Göring it's hopeless. Tell him that Britain's furniture makers have defeated the Luftwaffe. Maybe that's exactly what you should tell him. Henkel turned. Ziegler was standing now, his old body straightening with something like resolve. The war is lost, Karl. Not tomorrow, not next month, but eventually, inevitably. Every technical specialist in Germany knows it. We're being outproduced, out-innovated, outfought. The mosquito is just one example. One very visible, very humiliating example. The professor moved closer. You have a choice. You can spend the next year trying to build a copy that will never match the original. Or you can tell the truth, face the consequences, and maybe save some young men from dying in aircraft you know will fail. They'll court-martial me, at best. Probably. And you? For suggesting it. Ziegler smiled. I'm 72 years old. I've had a good life, a long life. What can they do to me that age won't do worse? He placed a hand on Henkel's shoulder. You asked me once why I became a scientist instead of joining my father's medical practice. Remember what I told you? To seek truth regardless of cost. Exactly. The mosquito is truth, Karl. It's telling us something important about innovation, about culture, about the nature of excellence. Are you going to listen? Or are you going to waste the next year building a lie? Henkel walked back to his hotel through streets that grew darker with each block. The streetlights were out blackout protocols, but the moon was bright enough to navigate by. Somewhere overhead, bomber engines droned. The sirens would wail soon. People would crowd into shelters, huddling together in the dark, wondering if tonight would be the night their building took a direct hit. He thought about the men who built the mosquito. Not the engineers he'd read their names in the intelligence reports, Geoffrey de Havilland and his team at Hatfield, but the workers. The men whose names would never appear in any report, who came to work each morning, spread glue on wooden forms, clamped joints with the perfect pressure born of decades of experience, and went home each evening to families they were protecting with every perfect bond. Those men were winning the war, not with grand strategy or superior firepower, but with quiet excellence, with the accumulated wisdom of hands that knew wood the way a musician knows their instrument, with pride in craft that transcended nationalism or ideology. Germany had tried to win through industrial might, through mass production and standardization and the reduction of craftsmanship to mere manufacturing. And it was failing. Not because German engineers were less capable, but because they'd forgotten something essential. That excellence couldn't be imposed from above. It had to grow from below, from a culture that valued mastery, that gave craftsmen time to perfect their art, that understood that the fastest way to build something truly good was to build it slowly, carefully. Right? The sirens began. Henkel kept walking. If the bombs came, they came. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending that the war wasn't already lost. Tomorrow he would return to Hamburg. He would examine the mosquito again. He would write another report, this one more honest than the first. And then he would face whatever consequences came. But tonight, walking through Berlin's ruins, under a bomber's moon, Henkel allowed himself a moment of clarity. The mosquito wasn't just an aircraft. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, Germany saw not British strength, but German weakness. Not enemy innovation, but their own failure of imagination. The wooden bomber had revealed a truth more devastating than any bomb that they had built their entire military philosophy on false assumptions about what made an aircraft or an army or a nation truly strong. The truth reached England before Henkel's second report ever left his desk. RAF Benson, Oxfordshire, December 3, 1943. Wing Commander Adrian Warburton was developing film from the previous night's reconnaissance run when he stopped, squinted, called over his photo interpreter. The images showed Focke-Wulf's Bremen facility, and something was different. New construction. Long, low buildings with distinctive roof profiles. Looks like furniture workshops, the interpreter said. Warburton felt his stomach tighten. Get this to de Havilland, now. At Hatfield, 60 miles north of London, Geoffrey de Havilland received the intelligence report at 1400 hours. He read it twice, then walked down to the production floor without saying a word. Around him, the organized chaos of wartime manufacturing hummed with purpose. Former piano makers were fitting wing sections. Cabinet builders were bonding fuselage halves. Boatwrights were checking joint integrity with touches so light they seemed like caresses. "They're copying us," he told his chief engineer, Charles Walker. Walker looked up from a drawing board. "Can they? Not well, not quickly, but they'll try." De Havilland watched a craftsman named Edward Jennings spread adhesive on a curved form with the precision of a surgeon. Jennings had built harpsichords in Shoreditch for 30 years before the war. Now he built bombers. "And when they fail, they'll come for us." "Let them come. Charles, listen to me. We're not building Spitfires here. We don't have concrete blast walls or dispersed facilities. We're in converted furniture factories. One good raid and then we disperse." Walker's voice carried the calm of a man who'd already considered every scenario. "Break production into smaller units, spread it across the country. They can't bomb what they can't find." But de Havilland knew better. Dispersal meant inefficiency. Inefficiency meant fewer aircraft. Fewer aircraft meant more bomber crews dying over Germany because they didn't have the Mosquito's speed to protect them. The mathematics of war were brutal and unyielding. That night, he didn't sleep. He walked through the silent factory, his footsteps echoing on concrete floors, still warm from the day's work. Half-finished Mosquitoes stood in various stages of completion, their plywood skins gleaming under emergency lighting. Each one represented 1,800 man-hours of labor. Each one carried the accumulated knowledge of craftsmen who'd spent lifetimes learning how wood behaved under stress. He stopped at Station 7, where tomorrow Jennings would complete the bonding on Mosquito DZ628. The fuselage halves lay waiting their inner surfaces, already coated with phenolic resin, the smell sharp and chemical in the still air. In 12 hours, those halves would be brought together, clamped, heated to 160 degrees Celsius for 6 hours. The glue would flow, penetrate, bond. And when the clamps released, there would be no joint line, just a single unified structure stronger than its components. De Havilland ran his hand along the interior. The wood was smooth, flawless. Whoever had prepared this section knew their craft completely. Every ply laid perfectly, every grain aligned for maximum strength. This wasn't manufacturing. This was art that happened to be deadly. His mind went to the German engineers he'd never meet. Men probably not so different from himself. Competent, desperate, trying to solve an impossible problem under intolerable pressure. They would study the Mosquito's construction, analyze the adhesive attempt replication. And they would fail, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked time. The Mosquito's development had taken 3 years of careful refinement. Germany needed results in months. He thought about what that meant. Shortcuts. Substitutions. Inadequate testing. Aircraft that looked like mosquitoes, but flew like coffins. Young men dying because their leaders demanded the impossible, and their engineers couldn't say no. Back in Hamburg, Henkel was discovering exactly that. January 1944. Kurt Tank's design bureau at Focke-Wulf had produced the first drawings for the Ta-154. The aircraft looked aggressive on paper, twin engines, heavy armament, all-wood construction. Göring had seen the renderings and declared it Germany's salvation. Production orders were issued before the first prototype even existed. Henkel's role was material certification. He stood in Tank's office, looking at specifications that made his chest tight. "You're calling for Baltic pine substitution for the balsa core?" Henkel asked. Tank didn't look up from his drafting table. "We have no balsa. We have pine. Use pine. Pine is 3 times heavier. The weight penalty will be offset by more powerful engines. Next issue. The adhesive. You're specifying Tego film glue." "Correct. Dynamite Nobel has guaranteed supply." Henkel set down the specifications. Hair Tank Tego film is casein-based, derived from milk protein. It's moisture-sensitive, temperature-sensitive, and loses bond strength above 60 degrees Celsius. The British use synthetic resin precisely because it's stable under combat conditions. The British, Tank said, finally looking up, have access to tropical cashew nuts for plasticizers. We have cows. We use what we have. What we have will kill the pilots." The room went silent. Tank stood slowly, his face expressionless. He was a brilliant designer, one of Germany's best, but he was also a survivor. Men who spoke truth to power didn't tend to survive long in 1944 Germany. Dr. Henkel Tank said carefully, "I have been given 6 months to produce a German Mosquito. Not 8 months, not a year, 6 months. I will use Baltic pine. I will use Tego film glue. I will use whatever materials the Reich can provide, and I will deliver an aircraft that meets specifications on paper. What happens after that is not my concern. It should be. Should be doesn't matter anymore. Can and can't are the only words that mean anything now." Tank returned to his drawings. "You'll sign the material certification, or I'll find someone who will." Henkel walked out, knowing he should refuse, knowing that his signature would be complicity. But he also knew that refusing meant court-martial, and court-martial meant execution, and execution meant his wife Helena would be alone in a burning country with their 2 daughters. The mathematics of survival were as brutal as the mathematics of war. He signed. The first Ta-154 prototype flew on July 1, 1944. For 11 minutes it performed beautifully. Responsive controls. Good speed. Then the pilot reported vibration. Then the vibration became violent. Then the port wing separated at the root, and the aircraft tumbled into a forest outside Bremen, killing everyone aboard. Henkel was part of the investigation team. They found the failure point within hours. The Tego film adhesive had delaminated under aerodynamic stress. Not everywhere, just at the critical joint between wing spar and fuselage. Just enough to allow microscopic movement. Just enough to start a crack that propagated in milliseconds. He stood in the wreckage field looking at the shattered wing section and thought about the British craftsman who'd bonded DZ-414's wings. That man's joints had held through combat stress flak damage and a belly landing. This joint had failed in perfect weather because someone in Berlin had decided that casein glue was good enough. "Sabotage," Oberst Peltz declared at the inquiry. "The dynamite Nobel plant has been infiltrated. Question everyone. Find the traitor." But Henkel knew there was no traitor. Just bad chemistry rushed development, and the fundamental impossibility of copying genius without understanding what made it genius. The Mosquito succeeded because every component was optimized through years of testing. The Ta-154 failed because every component was compromised by necessity and desperation. They built 3 more prototypes. 2 crashed. The third flew successfully for 6 weeks before its adhesive degraded in summer heat, and the tail section delaminated during a training flight. The pilot survived. Barely. He was 20 years old, decorated for bravery over Russia, and now terrified to fly an aircraft that might disintegrate around him without warning. "How do you fight?" the pilot asked Henkel afterward, his hands still shaking. "When you're more afraid of your own plane than the enemy." Henkel had no answer. By August 1944, the Ta-154 program was quietly cancelled. Göring never acknowledged the failure publicly. 53 aircraft had been partially completed. They were broken up for firewood. Henkel's signature on the material certification meant nothing now except as evidence of his complicity in a disaster everyone wanted to forget. But across the channel, the Mosquito production accelerated. De Havilland had dispersed manufacturing exactly as Walker suggested. Components came from workshops in Yorkshire, Scotland, Wales. Small facilities, easy to hide, hard to target. Final assembly remained at Hatfield, but even that was partially underground, now protected by earthworks and camouflage. By September 1944, Mosquito production exceeded 100 aircraft per month. Losses remained under 1%. The RAF was using them for everything: bombing, reconnaissance, night fighting, pathfinding. The wooden ghost had evolved into an entire ecosystem of wooden ghosts, each variant optimized for specific roles, each one devastating German operations with impunity. Henkel received reports of every Mosquito raid. He read them in his Hamburg office windows covered with blackout curtains, maps on the walls showing shrinking German territory. Each report was a reminder of his failure. Not technical failure, he'd warned them about the adhesive, the substitutions, the impossible timeline. But moral failure. He'd signed the certification knowing it was inadequate. He'd chosen survival over truth. In October, a package arrived at his office. No return address. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small piece of plywood. Birch faces balsa core bonded with phenolic resin. A note in English translated by someone into German, from the craftsmen of Hatfield. Excellence takes time. Imitation takes lives. Henkel kept it in his desk drawer. Some nights when the bombers came and the building shook, and he wondered if this would be the night his luck ran out, he would take out that piece of plywood and run his fingers over the joints. Flawless. Perfect. The work of men who understood that their craft mattered not because it was impressive, but because lives depended on getting it right. He thought about the young pilot who'd survived the tail section delaminating. Thought about the others who hadn't survived. Thought about every corner cut, every specification compromised, every warning ignored, because the timeline mattered more than the truth. The war was ending. Everyone knew it now, even if nobody said it aloud. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Western Allies were advancing through France. The bombing raids grew more frequent, more devastating. And through it all, Mosquitoes flew overhead reconnaissance aircraft documenting Germany's destruction bombers hitting precision targets. Night fighters shooting down the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. December 1944. Professor Ziegler died. Henkel found out 3 days after the funeral. Heart attack, they said. Though Henkel suspected it was something simpler. The old man had stopped wanting to live in a world where excellence was sacrificed to expediency. At the graveside, Henkel stood alone. The cemetery was nearly empty. Most people were either fled or dead, or too afraid to attend funerals anymore. He placed the piece of British plywood on Ziegler's grave. His old professor would have appreciated the gesture, would have understood what it meant. "You were right," Henkel said to the frozen ground. "I should have told the truth, should have refused to sign, should have had the courage to face consequences rather than participate in a lie." He paused, breath misting in the December cold. "But I didn't, and men died. And I'll carry that until I join you." He walked away through snow that was already covering his footprints. Behind him, the piece of perfect British plywood lay on a German grave, a small monument to the difference between what could have been and what was. To the space between innovation and imitation. To the terrible price of choosing survival over integrity. That night, the last mosquito raid of 1944 hit Hamburg. Henkel heard them overhead, that distinctive engine note high and fast. No sirens this time. The warning system had been destroyed weeks ago. Just the sound of wooden aircraft carrying precision bombs to targets they would hit with devastating accuracy. He didn't go to the shelter. He sat at his desk, listening to distant explosions, reading his final report on the T-154 failure. He'd written it for no one. No one would read it. No one cared anymore about why things failed, only that they had. But he'd written it anyway, documenting every compromised decision, every ignored warning, every choice that prioritized speed over safety. At the bottom, he added one final note. The Mosquito succeeded because its builders had time to be excellent. The TA-154 failed because we demanded miracles on impossible schedules. We forgot that true innovation cannot be rushed, that copying genius requires understanding genius, and that the fastest way to build something good is to build it carefully. This is a lesson paid for in lives. I pray it is not forgotten. He sealed the report, addressed it to no one, locked it in his desk. Perhaps someday when the war was over and the reckoning came, someone would find it. Perhaps they would learn what he had learned too late, that in the space between what you know is right and what you do anyway, entire futures are lost. Outside, the bombers returned to England. Inside, in a darkened Hamburg office, a man who'd chosen survival over truth waited for a dawn he wasn't certain would come. The Mosquito had revealed more than technical superiority. It had revealed the cost of abandoning excellence for expediency, of choosing speed over integrity, of demanding the impossible and punishing those who couldn't deliver it. In that revelation, in that mirror held up by British craftsmen to German engineers, was a lesson more devastating than any bomb: that a nation built on compromised principles could not defeat a nation built on uncompromising excellence. The spring of 1945 brought no relief, only acceleration toward an ending everyone could see, but no one could stop. April 12th. Henkel was sorting through files when the door to his office burst open. No knock. No warning. Two SS officers, their uniforms still crisp despite the chaos-consuming Germany. The taller one spoke with the flat affect of someone who'd delivered this speech too many times. "Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, you are ordered to Thuringia, immediately. Bring your technical documentation." "What's in Kayla?" "Underground facility. Aircraft production." The officer's eyes were dead. "You leave in 1 hour." Helena was in the kitchen when he came home. She looked up from potato peels, their rations for the week, and saw his face and understood immediately. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know." "Will you?" She stopped. They both knew the question had no answer. Men who went to underground facilities this late in the war often didn't come back. Not because they died, but because there was nothing left to come back to. He held her. Their daughters Marie and Greta, 8 and 6, played in the next room oblivious. Helena's heart hammered against his chest. "If I don't return," he said quietly, "take the girls and go west. To the American sector. Not the Russians. Never the Russians." She nodded against his shoulder. They'd discussed this before. Everyone had discussed this before. The Red Army was coming from the east, and what happened in their wake, the stories filtering back from refugees, made death seem preferable. "The report in my desk," Henkel continued. "The sealed one about the Ta-154. Take it. Hide it. Someday it might matter. Carl, promise me." "I promise." He left without seeing his daughters. Couldn't bear to. The truck was already running, exhaust visible in the cold spring air. 6 other engineers climbed aboard, none speaking. They drove south through countryside that looked peaceful, if you ignored the columns of refugees, the burned-out tanks, the occasional body in a ditch that no one had time to bury. Kayla was hell carved into limestone. The underground facility stretched for miles beneath the Thuringian hills, a maze of tunnels blasted by slave labor, lit by bare bulbs that cast everything in sickly yellow. Here, in the last desperate months, Germany was building its final aircraft. Me-262 jets assembled in caverns where sunlight never reached, where the air tasted of diesel fumes and human misery. Henkel's assignment was structural integrity assessment. But what he found in Kayla had nothing to do with engineering, and everything to do with the complete abandonment of anything resembling humanity. The workers were skeletons. Not metaphorically, actually skeletal. Concentration camp prisoners worked 18-hour shifts, beaten if they slowed, shot if they collapsed. Henkel watched a boy really couldn't have been more than 16, drop a rivet gun. An SS guard broke the boy's hand with a truncheon. Casually, like swatting a fly. The boy picked up the tool with his left hand and kept working, tears streaming silently. "Don't interfere," warned another engineer, a man named Brandt who'd been there a month. "Don't even look at them. The guards are nervous. Everything's collapsing. They'll kill you for blinking wrong." That night, crammed into a barrack with 30 other technical staff, Henkel couldn't sleep. The camp prisoners were housed in adjacent tunnels, and through the limestone he could hear coughing. Constant coughing. The sound of lungs failing in the chemical-thick air. He thought about the British craftsmen at Hatfield, piano makers who went home each evening to families, cabinet builders who took pride in perfect joints, boatwrights who worked with dignity in clean, well-lit factories. They had built the Mosquito with care because they were treated with care, with respect, with the understanding that excellence required not just skill, but humanity. Germany had built its final aircraft with slaves in caves, and somehow expected them to be better. April 20th, Hitler's birthday. The tunnels echoed with forced celebrations, speeches over loudspeakers, exhortations to final victory, promises that secret weapons would still turn the tide. But outside, American artillery was clearly audible. Getting closer, getting louder. The guards grew more violent. Production quotas increased even as supplies dwindled. Me-262s rolled out of the tunnels incomplete missing instruments. Hydraulic systems hastily assembled anything to meet the numbers demanded by men who were themselves running out of time. Henkel watched a prisoner he never learned the man's name install a fuel line backward. The guard didn't notice. Henkel started to point it out, then stopped. That Me-262 would explode on startup, would kill its pilot, would remove one more German fighter from the war. He said nothing. That night he vomited in the latrine until his stomach was empty. Brandt found him there, handed him water. "How long have you been here?" Henkel asked. 5 weeks. Feels like 5 years. Brandt lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You know what's happening, right? This isn't about aircraft production anymore. It's about keeping the prisoners here. If we evacuate, they'll have to kill them all. Too many witnesses, too many crimes. So we keep assembling jets that will never fly while the Americans get closer, and we all pretend there's still a purpose. Why don't you leave? Leave to where Berlin's surrounded, Hamburg's ruins. My family was in Dresden." Brandt took a long drag, the cigarette tip glowing orange in the dark. "There is no leave anymore. There's only here and the chaos outside. At least here there's food. Rations, but food." April 30th. The day Hitler died, though they wouldn't learn that for 2 more days. What they learned immediately was that the Americans had broken through at Weimar, 12 miles north. The guards began destroying documents, burning files in oil drums. The smoke made the already toxic air nearly unbreathable. Henkel was reviewing structural calculations, meaningless work, but what else was there to do when he heard shouting? Running. He emerged from his tunnel section to find chaos. Guards were herding prisoners toward the eastern tunnels, away from the approaching Americans, deeper into the limestone labyrinth. "Where are they taking them?" Henkel asked an SS Unterscharführer he'd seen before, one of the less violent ones. "Sealed sections, old mining shafts. The Americans are 2 hours away. We can't leave witnesses." The words took a moment to register. Sealed sections, old mining shafts. They were going to trap them, bury them alive. Henkel grabbed the guard's arm without thinking. "You can't!" The guard's pistol was out and pressed against Henkel's forehead before he could finish. They stood like that for an eternal second. Then from outside came the unmistakable sound of tank engines. American tank engines. The guard holstered his weapon and ran. The next 3 hours were madness compressed into a space too small to contain it. SS guards fled east. Some prisoners followed their captors too broken to understand liberation was coming. Others collapsed where they stood, unable to process that survival might actually be possible. Henkel and the other engineers huddled in a side tunnel listening to gunfire explosions, the metallic thunder of armored vehicles, then silence, then voices. American voices, Southern accents and Brooklyn drawls and Midwestern vowels echoing through limestone tunnels that had heard only German and screaming for months. First Lieutenant James Morrison, 89th Infantry Division, was 23 years old and completely unprepared for what he found in Kayla. His after-action report, filed May 2, 1945, described approximately 400 prisoners in various states of physical collapse. Evidence of systematic abuse. Bodies in sealed shaft number 7, cause of death unclear, but likely deliberate. Half-assembled jet aircraft of no apparent military value. Henkel watched American medics move through the tunnels, their faces showing shock, rage, incomprehension. One medic who looked younger than Henkel's daughter kept saying, "Jesus Christ," over and over, like a prayer or curse, or both. Morrison found Henkel in the engineering section, still wearing his civilian clothes, still surrounded by meaningless calculations. "You work here. Morrison's German was textbook perfect. Materials engineer, Luftwaffe. I was ordered here 3 weeks ago. What did you do here? Henkel looked at the calculations at the tunnels at the prisoner's skeleton being carried past on a stretcher. Nothing that mattered, nothing that helped. He met Morrison's eyes. Nothing that stopped this. Morrison studied him for a long moment. Come outside. All technical personnel outside for questioning. The daylight hurt. Henkel hadn't seen sun in 3 weeks, and his eyes watered as he emerged from the tunnel entrance into a spring afternoon that seemed obscene in its beauty. Birds sang. Wildflowers bloomed in the grass. A few hundred meters away, American tanks idled their crews, smoking cigarettes and looking at the tunnel entrance like it might vomit up demons. They questioned the engineers for 6 hours. Who ordered what? Who did what? Who knew what? Henkel told them everything. About the Ti-154 failure, the compromised adhesive, the impossible timelines, the choice between complicity and death. About the last 3 weeks watching prisoners work to death while guards assembled aircraft that would never fly. Did you try to stop it? Morrison asked. No. Why not? Because I was afraid. The admission felt both liberating and damning. Because I told myself that my death wouldn't change anything, that someone else would take my place, and at least I might survive to tell someone someday. He gestured at the tunnel entrance where more prisoners were being carried out. I told myself comfortable lies while men died around me. Morrison closed his notebook. You'll remain in custody pending war crimes assessment. Don't try to leave the area. But there was nowhere to leave to. The war ended a week later. Germany surrendered. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. And in the ruins amid the displaced millions and bombed cities and mass graves, people like Henkel tried to figure out what came next. He spent 4 months in a displaced persons camp outside Weimar. Not a prisoner exactly, not charged with anything specific, but not free either. He shared a tent with Brandt and 2 other engineers from Kala. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? In August, Helena found him. She'd walked most of the way from Hamburg, the girls taking turns riding in a borrowed handcart. Marie had a cough that wouldn't quit. Greta's feet were wrapped in rags because her shoes had worn through. But they were alive. Together. That was something. I brought your report, Helena said, handing him the sealed document he'd written about the Ta-154. I don't know if it matters anymore. Probably doesn't. But Henkel unsealed it anyway, read his own words about excellence and compromise, about the difference between innovation and imitation. They felt both true and irrelevant. What did aircraft design philosophy matter when millions were dead? September 1945. The Americans brought a package to Henkel's tent. Inside was that piece of British plywood he'd placed on Ziegler's grave. A note attached, found this in Hamburg, thought you might want it back. Also, someone at de Havilland would like to speak with you. The letter was from Geoffrey de Havilland himself. Written in careful German, it expressed condolences for Ziegler's death, acknowledged the technical challenge Henkel had faced, and extended an invitation. When you are able, when the occupation authorities permit, I would like you to visit Hatfield, not as enemy to victor, but as engineer to engineer. There are things we should discuss about the future of aviation, about composite materials and bonded structures, about the principles we discovered building the Mosquito. I believe you understand these principles perhaps better than anyone in Germany. That understanding should not be lost. Henkel read the letter 3 times. An invitation from the man whose aircraft had humiliated Germany, whose wooden ghost had exposed every flaw in the Luftwaffe's philosophy, whose craftsmen had built something so good that German engineers had killed themselves trying to copy it. Will you go? Helena asked. I don't know. Maybe, eventually. He folded the letter carefully. But first we need to find somewhere to live. Get the girls in school. Figure out how to survive in a country that doesn't exist anymore. It would be 2 years before Henkel finally visited Hatfield. By then, the world had moved on. The Mosquito was obsolete, surpassed by jets. The craftsmen who'd built it were returning to peacetime work furniture again, pianos again, boats again. But their legacy remained in every fiber-reinforced polymer, every bonded composite, every aircraft structure that prioritized elegance over brute strength. De Havilland walked Henkel through the silent factory. The forms where fuselage halves had been bonded now gathered dust. The autoclaves sat cold. But the principles lived on. "We never meant to humiliate anyone," de Havilland said. "We just needed to build something quickly with the materials we had. Wood and glue, that's all." "That's everything," Henkel replied. He touched one of the forms, felt the smooth surface where thousands of mosquitoes had been born. "You proved that innovation requires time, that excellence cannot be rushed, that copying without understanding is worse than not trying at all." He paused. "We learned that lesson, paid for it in blood. Will Germany remember it? I don't know. I hope so." Henkel thought about the Ta-154, about Kayla, about all the compromised choices that seemed necessary at the time and catastrophic in retrospect. "We built our entire philosophy on strength through force. You proved there was another way, strength through intelligence, through craft, through giving people time to be excellent." He looked at de Havilland. "That's what the Mosquito really taught us. Not how to build wooden aircraft. How to build a culture that values excellence over expedience." They stood in silence for a moment, two engineers separated by language and history, but united by understanding what it meant to build something that mattered. Outside, Britain was rebuilding. Germany was divided. The world was learning to live with nuclear weapons and Cold War, and the knowledge that the next conflict might make this one seem gentle by comparison. But in that silent factory surrounded by the ghosts of wooden bombers, a different kind of knowledge prevailed. The knowledge that true innovation required not just technical skill, but moral courage. That the fastest way to build something good was to refuse to build something bad. That excellence demanded not just intelligence, but integrity. Henkel never returned to engineering. He taught instead at a technical university in Munich, where he made his students study not just the Mosquito's design, but its development philosophy. Made them understand that every technical choice was also an ethical choice. That saying yes when you should say no had consequences measured in lives. The war had ended. But its lessons paid for in the lives of prisoners in limestone tunnels, pilots in disintegrating aircraft, engineers who chose survival over truth. Those lessons demanded remembering. The Mosquito had come as a ghost of wood to haunt Germany's skies. It left as proof that a nation's strength lies not in what it can force its people to build, but in what it allows them the time and dignity to build well. 40 years later, Henkel stood before a lecture hall at MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts, October 1987. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes, not from age, though he was 85 now, but from the weight of what he was about to say. The auditorium held 200 engineering students, their faces bright with the confidence of people who believed technology was neutral, that design was merely mathematics made physical. He was there to tell them otherwise. In 1943, Henkel began his English accented but clear. "I held in my hands the most beautiful piece of engineering I had ever encountered. It was wood and glue, nothing more, and it terrified me." He showed them slides of the Mosquito. The students leaned forward, intrigued by the elegant curves, the smooth plywood skin, the absence of rivets. Then he showed them the Ta-154. The similarities were obvious. The differences were fatal. "We copied the design," Henkel said. "We analyzed the chemistry. We replicated the construction techniques. And we failed. Not because German engineers were less capable, but because we forgot the first principle of innovation, that excellence cannot be rushed and integrity cannot be faked." A student raised her hand. "But surely, with enough resources, enough time." "We had neither, and that is precisely the point." Henkel advanced the slide. The next image showed the wreckage of the first TA-154 prototype. I signed the materials certification for this aircraft knowing the adhesive was inadequate. Knowing that substituting casein glue for synthetic resin was dangerous. I signed because refusing meant court-martial, and court-martial meant leaving my family alone in a burning country. I chose survival over integrity, and 3 men died in the first crash, 7 more in subsequent failures. The room had gone silent. I tell you this not for sympathy, but for warning. Every technical decision you make in your careers will also be an ethical decision. Every time you sign off on something you know is inadequate, you are choosing what matters more, your comfort or someone else's life. And that choice once made cannot be unmade. After the lecture, a young professor named David Chen approached. He was researching composite materials at Boeing, working on something he called carbon fiber reinforcement. Dr. Henkel, could I ask, do you think the Mosquito's bonding techniques have application to modern composites? They already do, Henkel replied. Every fiber-reinforced polymer, every bonded aircraft structure owes something to what de Havilland's craftsmen discovered. But more important than the technical legacy is the philosophical one, which is that the quality of what you build reflects the conditions under which you build it. The Mosquito succeeded because Britain gave craftsmen the time and respect to be excellent. The TA-154 failed because Germany demanded miracles from desperate men working under impossible constraints. Henkel smiled slightly. Technology is never neutral. It carries within it the values of the culture that creates it. That evening, Chen drove Henkel to the hotel. On the way, they passed a construction site where workers were installing steel beams with meticulous precision. Henkel watched them through the car window, men in hard hats moving with the confident efficiency of people who knew their work mattered. They remind me of the craftsmen at Hatfield, Henkel said. The way they check each connection, ensure each bolt is properly torqued. Pride in craft. That's what we lost during the war. That's what we're still trying to recover. Chen pulled up to the hotel entrance. Sir, can I ask something personal? Do you ever regret, after everything, do you ever wish you'd made different choices? Henkel was quiet for a long moment. Every day of my life. But regret is cheap. What matters is what you do with it. Whether you let it paralyze you, or whether you use it to ensure others don't make the same mistakes. Back in his hotel room, Henkel couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching Cambridge's lights, thinking about all the years since the war ended. Helena had died in 1979, her lungs finally giving out after decades of breathing Hamburg's poisoned air. Marie was a doctor in Frankfurt. Greta taught literature in Berlin. Both had families, children who asked questions about Opa's war questions. He tried to answer honestly, even when honesty meant admitting his own failures. He thought about the students in that auditorium, their faces so certain that engineering was about equations and material science. He'd been like that once, before Hamburg, before the Mosquito, before he learned that every technical choice was shadowed by moral consequence. The next morning, Chen picked him up again. I took the liberty of arranging something. There's a place I think you should see. They drove north to Salem to a small aviation museum housed in a converted warehouse. Inside, preserved with loving care, was a Mosquito, not a replica, an actual wartime aircraft serial number KB3336 that had flown 73 missions over Germany before being retired in 1946. Henkel approached it slowly. His legs weren't what they used to be, and his heart hammered in a way his doctor wouldn't like. But he needed to see it, needed to touch it one more time. The plywood skin was still smooth after 42 years. He ran his fingers along a seam, feeling for the joint line, finding nothing. Just that perfect integration of wood and adhesive that had defeated Germany's best minds. The smell was still there, too faint, but unmistakable. Phenolic resin and birch. The scent of excellence. Do you know who built this one? Henkel asked the museum curator, an elderly man named Robert Walsh. Actually, yes. We have the production records. This section, Walsh pointed to the port wing, was bonded by a man named Edward Jennings, harpsichord maker from Shoreditch. Worked at de Havilland from 1941 to 1945. Died in 1983. Did you ever meet him? Once, shortly before he passed. I asked him what it was like building mosquitoes. He said, Walsh paused, remembering. He said it was like building musical instruments, except these instruments sang over Germany. Henkel smiled despite himself. That was exactly right. The mosquito was a kind of music, the harmony of form and function craft, and purpose technique and soul. May I? Henkel gestured toward the cockpit. Walsh hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Climbing into the cockpit took effort, but Henkel managed. The interior was cramped pilot, and navigator sat shoulder to shoulder, no room for anything except essential instruments and each other. He touched the control column, imagined the men who'd flown this aircraft into flak and fighters, trusting their lives to joints made by a harpsichord maker they'd never meet. That trust. That was what the Mosquito represented. The trust between craftsman and flyer, between designer and builder, between a culture that valued excellence and the individuals who embodied it. Germany had broken that trust, had demanded the impossible, punished the honest, and rewarded those willing to lie about what could be achieved. Dr. Henkel would be. Walsh was looking concerned. Are you all right? Yes, just remembering. He climbed down carefully. Thank you for showing me this. That afternoon, Chen drove him to one more location. Not a museum this time, but a small cemetery in Concord. They walked between headstones until they reached a simple marker, Geoffrey de Havilland, 1882 to 1965. He gave us wings of wood. I didn't know he was buried here, Henkel said. He's not. He's buried in England. But his son Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. is here, test pilot. Killed in 1946 testing a prototype jet. There's a memorial stone for the father beside the son's grave. Henkel stood before the stone. De Havilland had outlived his son, had outlived the Mosquito's operational service, had lived to see jet aircraft make wooden bombers obsolete. But the principles remained. The understanding that excellence required time, that innovation demanded integrity, that the fastest way to build something good was to refuse to build something bad. I never got to thank him properly, Henkel said. When I visited Hatfield in '47, we spoke for hours about technical details, about composite materials and bonding techniques and the future of aviation. But I never thanked him for teaching me what engineering actually means. Not just the mathematics, but the ethics. Not just what we can build, but what we should build. I think he knew, Chen said. Perhaps. Henkel placed his hand on the memorial stone. But some things should be said aloud, even if only to the dead. They flew back to Munich the next day. Henkel spent the flight looking out the window at clouds 30,000 feet below, thinking about how strange it was that he was flying in a 747 aluminum and titanium built with rivets and welds, while below him somewhere a few mosquitoes still existed in museums, teaching new generations about wood and glue and the culture that made excellence possible. The 1990s brought the Cold War's end and Germany's reunification. Henkel lived to see the Berlin Wall fall, to see his country become whole again, to see a new generation of engineers who'd never known war or division. He taught until he couldn't anymore. His classes packed with students who came not just to learn about materials, science, but to hear stories about what happened when engineering divorced itself from ethics. In 1998, at 96 years old, Henkel received an invitation to return to Hatfield one final time. The factory was being closed, converted to housing. Before demolition began, they were holding a ceremony, a last gathering of the men and women who'd built mosquitoes during the war. He almost didn't go. His health was failing, travel was difficult, and he wasn't sure he wanted to face the past one more time. But Marie insisted. "Papa, you need to see this. You need to close that chapter properly." So he went. Hatfield, May 1998. The factory looked smaller than he remembered, more worn. But inside in the main assembly hall, 200 people had gathered. Most were in their 70s and 80s now, the craftsmen who'd built wooden bombers when they were young, when Britain's survival had depended on their skills. A woman approached him. She was perhaps 75, face lined, but eyes sharp. "Dr. Henkel, I'm Elizabeth Jennings, Edward's daughter. Your father built harpsichords." "He did. And mosquitoes. Section 7 wing assembly. He talked about it until the day he died, about how the wood had to be perfect, how the glue had to be mixed exactly right, how every joint mattered because lives depended on it." She smiled. He was very proud of his work, said it was the most important thing he ever did. He had reason to be proud. His craftsmanship defeated the Luftwaffe more effectively than any fighter. The ceremony began. Speeches about history and legacy, about the mosquito's contribution to victory, about the marriage of traditional craft and modern warfare. But what struck Henkel most was when they invited the workers themselves to speak. No prepared remarks, just memories. An old man named Thomas Wright, who'd been a boat builder before the war. "We knew every aircraft we built would fly into danger, so we built them as if our own sons would be flying them, because maybe they were." A woman named Sarah Mitchell, who'd worked in the adhesive mixing room. "The smell never left my clothes. My husband complained. But I didn't mind. That smell meant we were doing something that mattered, that we were beating the Nazis with wood and glue and careful hands." Another man, George Patterson, who'd supervised final assembly. "Sometimes I'd stand on the tarmac watching them take off these wooden aircraft we'd built, and I'd think those are pieces of Britain flying into Germany. Not just bombs, but our values. Our belief that quality matters, that craftsmanship matters, that taking time to do things right matters." And they came back. Most of them came back, because we'd built them properly. When it was Henkel's turn to speak, he stood slowly leaning on his cane facing 200 people who'd done what German engineers couldn't: build excellence under pressure without compromising integrity. "I came here 50 years ago as a defeated enemy," he began. "I came to understand why we lost, and what I learned changed everything I thought I knew about engineering." He paused, gathering strength. "You did not defeat us with superior technology. You defeated us with superior culture. A culture that valued craftsmen, that gave them time to be excellent, that trusted their judgment and honored their skill. We had the same resources, the same knowledge, the same desperation. But we lacked what you had: the institutional wisdom to let excellence develop naturally, rather than demanding it on impossible schedules." His voice wavered. Marie, standing nearby, moved to help, but he waved her off. "I have spent the last 50 years teaching young engineers, and what I teach them isn't just materials science or structural mechanics. I teach them about this place, about men like Edward Jennings and women like Sarah Mitchell, who built something perfect because they were given the conditions necessary for perfection. I teach them that the mosquito's real lesson isn't about wood or glue. It's about what happens when a society values excellence over expedience, integrity over speed, and human dignity over production quotas." He looked around the old factory. "They're going to tear this place down soon. Turn it into apartments. That's fine. Buildings are temporary. But what happened here, the principles proven here, those are eternal. And it's our responsibility, those of us who remember, to ensure those principles survive even when the physical evidence disappears." After the ceremony, Elizabeth Jennings pressed something into his hand. A small wooden box, beautifully made, joints so perfect they seemed to be grown rather than assembled. "My father made this," she said. "Wanted you to have it. Said you'd understand what it meant." Henkel opened the box. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a small piece of plywood. Birch and balsa bonded with phenolic resin. Perfect grain alignment. Flawless adhesive penetration. A piece of a mosquito preserved by the man who'd built it. He kept this all these years. Until he died. Then I kept it. He said someday someone would come who needed to remember that excellence is possible. That even in war, even under pressure, humans can create something beautiful if they're given the chance. She closed his hands around the box. I think he meant you. Henkel couldn't speak. He held the box, felt the weight of it, not just the physical weight, but the weight of memory, of lesson, of proof, that even in humanity's darkest hours, light was possible. They demolished Hatfield factory in 2000. Henkel watched the news footage from Munich, tears streaming down his face, as the building where craftsmen had proven that wood could defeat steel finally fell to bulldozers. But he still had the box, still had that piece of perfect plywood, and he still had the lesson it represented. He died in 2002 at 100 years old. At his funeral, Marie read from his final letter. I spent the first half of my life learning how to build things. I spent the second half learning why some things should never be built, no matter how technically impressive. The Mosquito taught me that distinction. It taught me that innovation without integrity is just cleverness in service of nothing worth serving. That excellence demands not just skill, but moral courage. That the greatest technical achievement is worthless if built on compromised principles or broken lives. The letter concluded, to every young engineer who reads this, remember that what you build carries within it the values of how you built it. Choose those values carefully. Choose integrity over expedience. Choose excellence over speed. Choose humanity over efficiency. Because in the end, we're not remembered for what we built, but for how we built it. The Mosquito proved that truth can defeat power, that craft can overcome brutality, that a culture committed to excellence will always surpass a culture committed only to victory. Remember that. Build from that. And perhaps the next generation won't need to learn these lessons through catastrophe. Today, pieces of Henkel's story live in engineering classrooms around the world. Professors use the Mosquito and TA-154 as case studies in how culture shapes technology, how ethical compromises lead to technical failures, how the fastest way to build something good is to build it with integrity from the start. In Munich, at the Technical University, where Henkel taught for decades, there's a small display. A piece of plywood under glass, birch, and balsa, perfectly bonded. Next to it, a photo of two men standing beside a Mosquito, Geoffrey de Havilland and Karl-Heinz Henkel, taken at Hatfield in 1947. Former enemies, united by understanding that excellence transcends nationalism, that craft recognizes no borders, that the pursuit of integrity matters more than the achievement of victory. The plaque reads, "They built this aircraft to win a war, but its real triumph was proving that human excellence, given time, respect, and moral foundation, can overcome any force built on compromised principles. Remember this when you build. Remember this when you choose between what is fast and what is right. Remember that in the space between those choices, the future is made." And beneath that, in smaller letters, if you believe these names should endure, share their story. Write a name in the comments, someone who taught you that integrity matters more than convenience, that excellence cannot be rushed, that the hardest choice is often the necessary one. Let their lessons live through memory, because memory in the end is the only resistance that time cannot erode. The Mosquito flew because craftsmen built it with care. The TA-154 failed because engineers built it with compromise. Both were wood and glue and human effort. But one was built from a culture that valued excellence, and the other from a culture that valued only results. That difference, invisible in the blueprints, undocumented in the specifications, meant everything. It meant the difference between innovation and imitation, between triumph and tragedy, between building something that lasted and building something that killed its creators. In the end, they tried to defeat wood with wood glue, with gluecraft, with desperation. And they learned what every generation must learn, that you cannot copy genius without understanding what makes genius possible. That excellence is not a technique, but a culture. That the Mosquito's real victory was not over Germany's Air Force, but over the idea that power alone determines outcomes. It proved that how you build matters as much as what you build. That integrity once compromised cannot be recovered with better engineering. That in the race between excellence and expedience, excellence always wins, just sometimes too late for those who chose the other path.